If you are black and you carry type O blood, then somewhere inside you there is a record that is older than your name, older than your country, and older than any history book ever written. For most of the last century, blood type was treated as a small medical detail. It was a letter on a hospital form, a code for a transfusion, a thing a nurse wrote down once and no one thought about again. Then scientists learned to read the DNA that sits behind that single letter, and the small detail turned into something far larger. The deepest part of the story is not about one nation, or one migration, or one lost kingdom. It reaches all the way back to the place where our species first drew breath. So where does that blood truly come from? Why might the small letter O on a medical chart be one of the oldest things a living person still carries? And why does almost no one tell you that your ancestry may sit very close to the root of the entire human family, rather than far out on some late and minor branch? Stay with me, because by the end of this you will hold a handful of facts that most tellings of ancestry quietly leave out, and you will not look at that letter the same way again. To understand why any of it matters, we have to begin with how a whole century of science underestimated a single letter. The study of blood groups begins in the year 1901, when an Austrian physician named Karl Landsteiner noticed that when he mixed certain blood samples together, some of them clumped while others stayed smooth. In that small observation, he had uncovered the blood group system, and he described the familiar types we still name today, AB, AB, and O. For decades after that, blood type stayed locked inside its box as a medical label. It mattered for transfusions and for surgery, and it was thought to say nothing at all about where a family came from. And there is a popular belief you have probably heard many times, repeated at dinner tables and in videos and in half-remembered articles. It says that type O is the oldest blood type, the original form, the one that all the others grew out of. Here we have to slow down and be precise, because the honest answer is more interesting than the myth. When geneticists finally opened up the gene that decides blood type and read it letter by letter, the simple folklore did not hold. The current evidence leans the other way. Type A looks more like the ancestral form, and type O appears to have arisen later, when a mutation broke the working copy of the A gene. So no, type O is very likely not the oldest type in the way the story is usually told. But do not leave, because the real history of that letter is far better than the myth it replaces. When researchers asked where the most common version of the O change first appeared, the trail did not point to Europe, and it did not point to Asia. It pointed straight back toward the continent where our species was born. Let me explain what type O actually is, because the mechanism becomes beautiful once you see it clearly. Your blood type is set by a single gene that sits on chromosome 9. That gene carries the instructions for an enzyme, and the enzyme decides whether small sugar molecules, called antigens, get placed on the surface of your red blood cells. When the gene works at full strength, it builds the A antigen or the B antigen and plants it on the cell like a flag. In type O, the same gene carries a tiny fault. A small piece of the genetic code is missing. In the most common version, a single letter has dropped out of the sequence, and that one absence is enough to switch the enzyme off. The red cell is then finished with no A flag and no B flag at all. It is a bare cell, carrying none of the usual banners. Now hold that little tube of blood in your mind, the one a nurse once drew from your arm, and see those bare cells drifting through it. That emptiness is not a lack of history. In the right light, it is a signature. And here's the clever part that genetics uncovered. The specific change that creates the most common form of type O did not appear at random in 100 separate places. It carries a pattern around it, a distinct arrangement of nearby DNA that lets researchers trace it backward through time, the way you might follow one family line through an old record book. The method is as elegant as the story. Every time a change is passed down through the generations, other tiny changes slowly gather beside it, like rings forming in the trunk of a tree. By counting and comparing those markers and type O carriers across the continents, scientists can estimate how old the variant is and roughly where it first arose. When they ran that clock backward, the trail led to Africa, and it led there early, before the first bands of humans ever left the continent to spread across the planet. Sit with that for a moment. Our species spent the overwhelming majority of its existence inside Africa, and only walked out in one great wave somewhere around 60 to 70,000 years ago. The letter O was already present before that departure. It was not a late arrival that popped up in some far corner of the world and drifted back. It was part of the genetic baggage that the first travelers carried on their backs when they left the cradle, and they took it across deserts and narrow straits and sheets of ice, out to every continent on Earth. Now here is where I want to be careful with you, because this is exactly the place where many videos quietly overreach. Type O is not rare, and it is not private to any one people. You find it almost everywhere, from the first peoples of the Americas to the islands of the Pacific to the far north of Europe. Across large parts of the world, it is in fact the most common blood type of all. So the letter O by itself cannot point a single finger at one homeland, and anyone who tells you that your